Welcome back, everyone. We're going to be trying to unpack and distill the essence of a recent conversation between Jordan Peterson and Lex Fridman.
Yeah, Peterson's interviews, they're always so dense and wide-ranging. It can be pretty challenging to keep up with it all, let alone try to, absorb all the ideas that are being thrown around.
Yeah, it's like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah.
But that's where we come in, right?
Exactly.
So we've meticulously gone through their entire conversation, and we've pulled out what we think are the most impactful takeaways, the most powerful quotes, and the most insightful anecdotes.
Exactly. The goal here is to give you the core of what Peterson and Fridman explored without the mental whiplash. We're focusing mainly on their discussion about, finding meaning in a world where a lot of our traditional value systems are being questioned and even, dismantled.
Right, like, can we create our own values, or is there some kind of inherent moral order that we need to align with? And how do we navigate a world where good and evil aren't always, super clear-cut?
That's some seriously heavy questions. But Peterson, like always, dives right in. He starts things off by acknowledging Nietzsche as a major influence on his thinking, particularly in terms of style. Peterson really admires Nietzsche's writing. It's got that real density and emotional impact. But Peterson doesn't stop there. He goes on to connect Nietzsche with Mircea Eliade. He's a historian of religions whose work Peterson finds, equally profound.
Wait, hold on. Who's Mircea Eliade? I'm not really familiar with his work.
Eliade was a Romanian scholar who studied the history of religion and myth, and his book, The Sacred and the Profane, that's particularly relevant here because it kind of offers an antidote to the kind of postmodern nihilism that Peterson often rails against. Eliade argued that humans have this really fundamental need to experience the sacred, the transcendent, and that this need is expressed through myths and rituals and symbols that connect us to something much larger than ourselves.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here. So both Nietzsche and Eliade, they're both kind of wrestling with these really huge existential questions, but they're coming at it from different angles.
Exactly. And Peterson is obviously fascinated by both of their approaches. But one thing that they all agree on is the power of language, right? Its power to shape our perception of reality. Peterson even goes so far as to say that great writing can actually change how we see the world.
Whoa, that's a pretty bold claim.
Oh, yeah.
How does he even justify that?
Well, he uses a really interesting analogy. He says that words are like these compressed images that the reader or the listener has to unpack and decompress back into actions and perceptions. So when you encounter a really powerful idea that's expressed in a well-crafted sentence, it's almost like receiving a mental upgrade, right? It literally changes the way your brain processes information.
Yeah, I'm starting to see why he loves Nietzsche so much. Every sentence is like a puzzle box just waiting to be unlocked. But this also raises an important point, don't you think? About the dangers of just blindly accepting any idea, no matter how well written or persuasive it might be.
You're right. That's precisely the next point that Peterson tackles. He warns against the dangers of unifying ideas, especially when those ideas are flawed or incomplete. He acknowledges that humans are drawn to these grand narratives. They give us a sense of purpose and meaning. These can be religious beliefs, political ideologies, or even personal philosophies. They help us make sense of the world and they give us some direction.
Right. It's comforting to think that there's a reason for everything, that our lives have a purpose beyond just eating, sleeping, and working.
Exactly. But Peterson argues that these unifying ideas can also be incredibly dangerous if we become too attached to them, or if we fail to critically examine their underlying assumptions. And he sees this happening a lot with ideologies that elevate power as the ultimate goal.
Like those who believe that any means are justified if they lead to greater power.
Precisely. And Peterson actually points to figures like Foucault and Marx as examples of thinkers who went down this path, arguing that their focus on power dynamics ultimately led to dangerous and even totalitarian ideologies. And he also warns against nihilism and hedonism. He sees those as equally problematic, unifying ideas.
It seems like he's saying that any idea taken to an extreme can become really harmful if we allow it to completely dominate our thinking.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And this kind of brings us to one of the most controversial figures in philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche, and his very famous declaration that God is dead.
Yeah, that's a line that gets thrown around a lot. But what did Nietzsche actually mean by that, and why is Peterson so concerned about it?
Well, Peterson interprets Nietzsche's statement as a warning about the consequences of removing these traditional value systems. Nietzsche wasn't like celebrating the death of God or anything. He was actually terrified of what might come in to fill the void that's left behind. And this is where Peterson's concerns really come into focus. He believes that without those kind of anchoring beliefs, we're left really vulnerable to all sorts of dangerous ideologies, including those that exalt power above all else.
So is he saying that we need to like go back to traditional religion in order to avoid these pitfalls?
Not necessarily. While Peterson often speaks favorably of religious traditions, he's also very critical of the ways they can become really rigid and dogmatic. He's more interested in exploring the psychological and the existential truths that these traditions have been grappling with for centuries.
That's fascinating. So where does Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch or Superman fit into all of this?
Yes, the Übermensch. This is where Peterson really pushes back against Nietzsche. Nietzsche argued that with the death of God, humans are totally free to create their own values and become these supermen who transcend conventional morality. But Peterson sees this idea as fundamentally flawed. He draws on Freud's theory of the psyche to argue that we're not as unified or as self-aware as we like to think we are.
I'm not sure I follow. What does Freud have to do with the Übermensch?
Well, Freud argued that the human psyche is made up of multiple and often conflicting drives and desires. He famously described the self as this fractionated plurality, meaning that we're constantly battling with these different parts of ourselves. Peterson uses this idea to challenge Nietzsche's notion of the self-created Übermensch.
So he's saying that if we're already kind of a mess of contradictions on the inside,
Yeah.
how can we possibly expect to create a coherent and lasting set of values for ourselves, let alone become supermen?
Exactly. And Peterson believes that this is where these traditional value systems, even those rooted in religion, can play a really crucial role in providing us with a framework for navigating these internal struggles. He even has a new book coming out. It's called We Who Wrestle with God, where he explores these ideas in even more depth. But that's a discussion for another time.
Definitely. But before we move on, I'm curious to hear more about what Peterson kind of proposes as an alternative to Nietzsche's Übermensch and the dangers of ideological possession.
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Peterson argues that true holders of these powerful ideas, they're willing to take responsibility for the consequences of those ideas. And he uses a very specific example to illustrate this point, the story of Christ's sacrifice in the Passion narrative.
Okay, now we're getting into some seriously deep theological territory.
Yeah, we are. But bear with me. Peterson isn't necessarily advocating for a literal interpretation of the Passion story here. Instead, he's using it as an archetype for understanding the relationship between power and responsibility. And he argues that Christ's willingness to sacrifice himself for his beliefs is a really powerful example of someone who truly embodies the weight and responsibility of holding a really transformative idea.
So he's kind of contrasting this self-sacrificing figure with those who seek power just for its own sake, like the Nietzschean Übermensch, who's ultimately only concerned with his own will to power, right?
Exactly. And he goes even further by drawing on the work of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He's the Russian novelist and dissident who wrote very extensively about the horrors of Soviet totalitarianism. Solzhenitsyn argued that in great literature, the battle between good and evil is played out internally, within the characters themselves.
So he's saying that the real battleground isn't out there in the world, but actually within each of us.
Precisely. And Peterson sees this as a moral imperative for every single individual. We have a responsibility to confront and constrain the evil within ourselves, even if it means facing some pretty painful truths about our own motivations and desires.
That's a really challenging idea. It's much easier to just kind of point fingers at the evil that's out there in the world than to acknowledge our own capacity for darkness.
It is challenging, but Peterson's adamant that this is the only way to truly combat evil in the world. We can't change the world if we're not willing to change ourselves first.
This is giving me a lot to think about. We've covered so much ground already.
Where we explore more of Peterson's thoughts on finding meaning, confronting evil, and living a life of purpose. Picking up where we left off, Peterson goes on to challenge Nietzsche's critique of Christianity as, slave morality.
Hold on. Slave morality? What does that even mean?
Well, it's a concept that Nietzsche used to describe what he saw as a system of morals that values weakness and humility and self-denial over strength and pride and self-assertion.
So like turn the other cheek and all that.
Exactly. Nietzsche believed that Christianity, with its emphasis on compassion and forgiveness, had kind of inverted the natural order of values, making the weak seem virtuous and the strong seem evil.
But Peterson doesn't buy that.
Not entirely. He argues that Nietzsche was mainly criticizing the pathologies of, like, institutionalized religion, not the gospel stories themselves. He points out that the woke phenomena, with its focus on victimhood and resentment, is actually a much better example of slave morality in action.
So he's saying that, like, constantly focusing on who's oppressed and who's the oppressor can actually be harmful.
That's one interpretation, yeah. Peterson argues that it creates this kind of moral hierarchy where your level of victimhood determines your status and power, and he's concerned that this can lead to a culture of resentment and division rather than genuine progress.
That's a really thought-provoking point. It makes you wonder if there's a way to advocate for social justice without kind of falling into the trap of what Nietzsche called slave morality.
Precisely. And this is where Peterson introduces another key concept, the importance of constraints.
Constraints,
Mhm.
as in like limitations or restrictions. I thought he was all about embracing freedom and individuality.
He is, but he also recognizes that true freedom can only exist within a framework of constraints. He uses the example of games like basketball or chess to kind of illustrate this point.
Okay, well, listen.
In both games, there are rules you have to follow, right? You can't just run around the court with the ball in your hand or move your knight diagonally across the board.
Right, otherwise it wouldn't be basketball or chess.
Exactly. And Peterson argues that these rules, these constraints, actually enhance our freedom and creativity, like within the game. He says, the more constrained the game, the more free the players, because the constraints tell them what the domain of play is.
That's a fascinating paradox. It's like saying that limitations can actually be liberating.
Exactly. And he applies this same logic to life in general. He believes that there's a kind of game that we're all playing, and to succeed, we need to understand the rules and play by them.
So what are the rules of this game of life, according to Peterson?
Well, he doesn't lay out like a specific set of rules or anything, but he argues that there's an inherent structure to reality that we can't simply ignore or wish away. He points to things like, the laws of physics, the principles of logic, and even the basic needs of human survival.
It seems like he's saying that we can't just create our own reality from scratch. There are certain fundamental truths that we have to contend with.
Precisely. And he believes that acknowledging these constraints, these limits to our freedom, is actually the key to living a meaningful and fulfilling life.
So it's not about rebelling against all constraints, but finding that sweet spot between structure and freedom.
Exactly. And Peterson argues that this is where those ancient wisdom traditions, often embodied in religious narratives, can be incredibly helpful.
He keeps coming back to religion, doesn't he?
He does. And it's not necessarily about, like, promoting any specific faith or anything. He sees religious texts as these repositories of psychological and existential wisdom that humans have been grappling with for centuries.
So what kind of wisdom can we find in these ancient stories?
Well, he brought up the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, pointing out that they were given this incredible freedom to do whatever they wanted, except for one thing, messing with that forbidden fruit.
Right, the one rule they couldn't follow.
Exactly. And Peterson sees this as a metaphor for recognizing that our freedom has limits. There are certain foundational truths that we can't simply disregard without facing consequences.
So it's like saying that even in a world where we have the power to choose our own path, there's still a kind of moral order that we need to respect.
Exactly. And he ties this back to his earlier point about the dangers of power as a unifying idea.
You mean the idea that any means are justified if they lead to greater power?
Precisely. Peterson argues that this kind of thinking ignores the inherent structure of reality, the moral order that underpins human existence. And he believes that it's this disregard for those fundamental truths that ultimately leads to tyranny and suffering.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. But I'm still wondering how we as individuals can navigate this complex moral landscape.
That's a great question. And this is where Peterson offers another thought-provoking idea. The most effective way to combat evil in the world is to first confront and constrain it within ourselves.
You're talking about facing our own, like, inner demons, right?
Exactly. He even quotes Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts."
Wow, that's a powerful statement. So he's saying that the real battleground isn't out there in the world, but actually within each of us.
Precisely. And Peterson sees this as a moral imperative, a responsibility we all have to confront those like shadow aspects of ourselves as tendencies towards, selfishness, envy, resentment, even if it's painful.
Yeah, I can see how that would be painful. It's much easier to just focus on the flaws of others than to acknowledge our own darkness.
It is challenging, but Peterson believes that it's the only way to truly combat evil in the world. He says, if you can't understand why someone would do something monstrous, look in the mirror.
Okay, I'm getting chills. That's both terrifying and inspiring at the same time.
It is. And it leads us to the next part of Peterson's argument, the importance of self-discipline and personal responsibility.
He seems to be saying that true strength doesn't come from denying our flaws, but from having the courage to acknowledge them and work on them.
Exactly. And he believes that this inner work is not only essential for our own well-being, but also for creating a more just and compassionate world.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. But I'm still wondering, how do we actually do this inner work? It sounds pretty daunting.
Well, Peterson offers some practical advice. He suggests that one of the most powerful tools we have is the word no.
Wait, no. How can simply saying no be so transformative?
Well, Peterson argues that no is essential for setting boundaries,
Yeah.
for enforcing consequences, for refusing to be manipulated or taken advantage of.
He even tied it back to Nietzsche's idea that much of what we call morality is actually cowardice. We're afraid to say no because we don't want to, like, rock the boat or risk disapproval.
Exactly. And Peterson believes that learning to use no effectively is a sign of true strength and integrity.
So it's not about being aggressive or confrontational, but about having the courage to stand up for ourselves and what we believe in.
Precisely. And he suggests that this ability to say no is not only crucial for our own well-being, but also for creating a society where people are held accountable for their actions.
Okay, that's a really powerful insight. But I'm also wondering, what about those situations where we're faced with choices that don't have a clear-cut right or wrong answer? Peterson and Fridman touched on this when they talked about the complexities of World War II.
Right, that was a really fascinating part of the conversation. They kind of grappled with the moral dilemma of allying with Stalin, who was undoubtedly a monstrous figure, to defeat Hitler, who was arguably even worse.
It's like that saying, sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. But even if it's necessary, it doesn't make the choice any easier.
Right. Peterson acknowledged that there are times when we're forced to choose between, bad options, and that those choices can have these really lasting consequences.
He even criticized the West for not fully confronting the horrors of communism after the war, allowing those ideologies to continue to spread.
Right, and this is a crucial point. Peterson's deeply concerned about the dangers of ideological possession, whether it's on the left or the right, because it can blind us to the complexities of reality and lead to these disastrous outcomes.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm also feeling a little bit overwhelmed by all this talk about evil and monstrous figures. Is there any hope for humanity? Are we doomed to just repeat these cycles of violence and destruction?
Well, Peterson offers a glimmer of hope. He and Fridman had this really fascinating discussion about online trolls and whether those engaging in toxic behavior are simply young people going through this rebellious phase or if they're truly psychopathic.
Oh, I remember that. Fridman seemed to be a little more optimistic, suggesting that most people are capable of being, socialized out of those destructive patterns.
Peterson agreed that there's this potential for redemption even for those who have engaged in pretty awful behavior.
He even pointed out that a lot of repeat criminal offenders stop offending as they get older, suggesting that it might be a matter of delayed maturation.
Right. And this is a really hopeful thought. It suggests that even in the darkest corners of human experience, there's still a possibility for growth and transformation.
That's a really powerful message,
Mm.
especially in a world that often feels so divided and cynical.
It is. And it brings us back to that central question of what it means to live a meaningful life, even in the face of suffering and temptation.
Peterson seems to be saying that it's not about finding easy answers or avoiding conflict, but about constantly striving to align ourselves with what's true and good, even if it's difficult.
Exactly. And he reminds us that we don't have to do this alone. We can draw on the wisdom of those who have gone before us, those who have wrestled with these same questions and found a way to live with integrity and purpose.
Wow, that's incredibly inspiring. But I'm also realizing that we've barely scratched the surface of this conversation.
There's so much more to unpack. We haven't even touched on Peterson's thoughts on the nature of belief, the importance of gratitude, or the power of personal transformation?
I guess that means we need to keep digging. For those of you who are still with us on this intellectual adventure, be sure to tune in for part 3 of this Jordan Peterson digest.
We'll be exploring even more of his fascinating insights and challenging you to think deeply about what it means to live a life of meaning and purpose.
Okay, so we're back, ready to kind of keep going through this treasure trove of ideas from Peterson's talk with Fridman. Where do we even go from here?
Well, one thread that really stuck with me was Peterson's emphasis on self-belief, especially when someone's facing challenges.
Yeah, he used the example of Job, a guy who endured unimaginable suffering but still clung to his faith.
Right. Peterson sees Job as this powerful example of human resilience, that capacity to hold on to hope, even when facing just overwhelming adversity.
But how do we cultivate that kind of unwavering faith, especially, when life throws curveballs our way?
Well, Peterson offers a very practical strategy. Focus on what you can control. He argues that we often have way more agency than we realize, but we just get so bogged down worrying about all the stuff that's outside of our influence.
So instead of lamenting about the state of the world, we should be concentrating on making those small, tangible improvements in our own lives.
Exactly. He's a huge proponent of this idea of incremental improvement. Those consistent daily efforts that might seem pretty insignificant at first, but they compound over time.
It's like that saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Precisely. And Peterson emphasizes that the payoff from these incremental improvements isn't linear, it's exponential, meaning even small changes can yield these surprisingly big results down the line.
That's encouraging. So we don't have to make these big radical changes overnight to actually see some progress.
Not at all. Peterson believes that consistency and perseverance, those are key. He even draws on his clinical experience as a psychologist to illustrate this.
Oh, I'm curious to hear about that.
He talks about how he learned to appreciate the power of no while he was working with clients who were struggling with some pretty difficult situations.
How does no tie into this whole self-improvement thing?
Well, Peterson realized that saying no isn't just about refusing something. It's about setting those boundaries, enforcing consequences, and ultimately taking control of your own life.
Didn't he also mention this applies to our relationships with other people?
Absolutely. Peterson argues that healthy relationships require that balance of firmness and empathy. Sometimes we need to be willing to say no to those people we love, even if it's hard, in order to actually help them grow.
So it's about pushing each other to become those best versions of ourselves, even if that means, having some tough conversations along the way.
Exactly. True love isn't about constantly pleasing the other person or enabling their destructive behaviors.
That makes a lot of sense. But this all still seems, I don't know, rather abstract. What are some concrete steps we can take to actually apply these principles in our own lives?
Well, Peterson emphasizes that we don't have to figure everything out on our own. He's a huge advocate for studying history, mythology, and religious texts.
He seems to believe there's a lot of wisdom to be gleaned from those sources.
He does. He sees these narratives as repositories of these profound insights into the human condition. They've been grappling with those big questions of meaning and morality for centuries.
So we can learn from the mistakes and the triumphs of those who came before us.
Exactly. Peterson encourages us to approach these stories with this open mind, to challenge our assumptions, and to extract that wisdom that can help us lead these more fulfilling lives.
It's almost like those stories provide a roadmap for navigating all the complexities of being human.
That's a great way to put it. And Peterson believes that by engaging with these timeless narratives, we can connect with something much larger than ourselves, tap into this collective wisdom that kind of transcends individual experience.
This has been a really, really thought-provoking journey through Peterson's ideas. From the power of language to the importance of saying no, to the wisdom that's embedded in those ancient stories. There's just so much here to unpack and ponder.
Absolutely. And we've really just scratched the surface. Peterson's work is always challenging us, always nuanced, always prompting us to think deeply about ourselves and that world all around us.
Well, I, for one, am eager to keep exploring his ideas. What a fantastic conversation to digest. And for our listeners, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes, where we'll be diving into all sorts of other really thought-provoking topics.